Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Kushel.
And I tell you what, Jeremy, there's just so many things going on. It's like it's so hard to dissect exactly just everything that I think just among the two of us we've been looking into just the last couple of hours of talking before going live here. There's just so much going on right now. I mean, you've got I think some extreme. Obviously, there's some fallout from this Miami Herald expose of Jeffrey Epstein. I'm really getting into a lot of details of the nature of the type of activities that were taking place with underage women at some of his various, particularly I'm thinking his various Florida properties, as well as other things. And you've got Alan Dershowitz coming out saying that he's still representing Jeffrey Epstein. And then you've got a very interesting article that we stumbled upon that we can get into here in a few minutes. We've got Jeffrey Epstein. We've got the investigations against Trump and Netanyahu both really seem to be heating up once again at the exact same time. It seems that Trump is getting increasingly irrational. Netanyahu's talking about how their common enemies are trying to bring them down during interviews with the Israeli press.
And
And
at
of
this
course,
very moment, you probably have Alex Jones saying, "The New World Order is trying to bring down the nationalist Bibi, Netanyahu, and Trump."
yes, and Putin as well, yes. And then but the French protest against the damn brown people in France, that's totally legitimate. And then on top of that, you've got the death of Mr. New World Order, George H.W. Bush. On top of all that, and I'm sure his legacy is being dissected ad nauseum by pretty much everyone who is affiliated with the alternative media, in addition to the disgusting, obviously traditional media whitewashing and lionizing of his bloodstained legacy. And perhaps we'll even get a little bit into George H.W. Bush
We
here,
were
but
such a moral nation before this goofball Trump, under the
see the
calm,
letter
patriotic hand of George H.W. Bush.
loved the CIA, and he loved the CIA. I mean, and also, did you see the letter he wrote to Bill Clinton? That was such civility. It's not like,
And
he never went on Twitter and lambasted his enemies the way Donald Trump
yeah,
does. He
he
wrote
let
a
Dana Carvey, do impressions of him and all of that.
Exactly. It's like you didn't go off on him like Trump does Alec Baldwin. It's just in the good nature of satire and keeping the great American bipartisan tradition alive. I mean, come on. I mean, George Bush. Anyway, we may talk a little bit about him. I'm sure it'll be a much different perspective than that. But I don't know, Jeremy. I'll ask you what's on your mind. Well, where do you think we should start with some of these stories? We only mentioned a few of the things that have been on our mind as of late, but it's just a matter of, gosh, I don't know where to begin on a week like this.
Yeah. Oh, and we forgot to bring up the whole the development of the special counsels and the indictments, and Michael Cohen coming out and basically putting on the court record that he was allegedly lying on behalf of Trump and Trump's political interest in terms of the conversations about Trump Tower Moscow. And so it's interesting, too, in the midst of all of that, as that begins to hit the mainstream media, that I still haven't seen anybody really explicating that Michael Cohen, his lawyer, I believe, still to this day is one Lanny Davis, who's known very much so in sort of like in the Democracy Now! Networks as a Clinton operative, as a Clinton lawyer operative. But it's also the fact that Lanny Davis was, or I don't know if still is, but was the lawyer of one Dmitry Firtash, who is one of the sort of, two oligarchs, I believe, two main oligarchs that are associated with Manafort's background and his work in Ukraine. And Firtash is also seen as a key functionary of this global Mogilevich Russian mob network. And so that should be put on the table, too, because it also relates then to questions about what is the Mueller probe actually going to get to. Is it going to be a cover-up to some extent, as previous investigations that Mueller has been involved in? Or is this a situation where you can sort of see Mueller as a defender of the U.S. national security and thus aspects of its deep state. But because of the frontal apparent assault by the Trump operation, the 11/9 operation, and how foreign it looks like it is in many ways, or at least there's key components. Not that there's not, domestic elements, and especially sort of pieces of the Iran-Contra network, of the elements of the Bush CIA syndicate, and the sort of Council for National Policy elements that are definitely key to this Trump operation domestically. It does look like that some of the global policy of this goes beyond the interests of the U.S. empire, and that it actually has to do with this intensely Russian-Israeli axis of some sort. And so it may be that Mueller, this has just sort of gone too far for someone like Mueller, who's willing to defend the interests of the CIA at some level, but he is not going to defend the interests of the FSB and the Mossad. So that remains to be seen. But I do think that it's important then to take this Cohen cooperation agreement and put it into the context of what are the things that Cohen will likely not put on the table that have to do with probably things like the real deep background of this Russian globally Jewish mob.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. And even I think it's important to point out that even if, like, obviously there's very real reasons to not trust and to be very critical and very honest about the legacy and the history of someone like Robert Mueller, who clearly has a history as a cover-up artist, particularly as the head of the FBI in that very crucial period, appointed just before September 11th, and operated over a lot of cover-ups during his time as the head of the FBI, which did extend into the Obama administration. But taking all of that aside, and even the possibility of this being a limited in scope investigation, as we were kind of discussing with the mutual acquaintance of ours yesterday, you even go outside of that, and you really just go even if it is at some point a limited scope operation. There's enough damning information on multiple fronts that that people who are willing to take the time and really dig into this and look into the names and the names and the faces and the incidents and events that keep popping up in this investigation, for people who really have their hands on the ball. And there are people doing this on social media and on other forums, places such as Medium, for example, are really putting these pieces together. You can make a case, and you can really, I think, start to put together a lot of dots and start crossing I's and dotting I's and crossing T's, so to speak, when it comes to putting the pieces together of a major operation that has on multiple fronts. And I think it's becoming easier and easier in a lot of ways for people like us even to connect a lot of dots based on things that are coming out in this Robert Mueller investigation. At one point, on one hand, you've got investigations into aspects of just Russia, but you've gone into Israel. We've gone into this grand alliance that's been formed with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other neighboring countries, along with Israel and the U.S., against Iran, which is at the center, I think, of the support coming from both the U.S. and Israel for one Mohammed bin Salman. And also outside of that, you've got this investigation digging into Brexit, which was a key event, obviously, before the election of Trump in the summer of 2016. And real quick, I'd like to mention a podcast, Dial M for Mueller. It's by a British investigative journalist. I do not want to butcher her name here, so I apologize ahead of time. Carol Cadwallader. I'm butchering the name. I think she writes for The Observer, which I think is the sister paper of The Guardian, or she has written for it. And in the first episode of the Dial M for Mueller podcast, she's zeroing in as a British journalist on Brexit, and she mentions in this a key meeting, or what appears to be a key meeting, that was relayed to her by one of the makers of the Netflix documentary Get Me, Roger Stone, which this person relayed to her a meeting between Roger Stone, Nigel Farage and Alex Jones during the Republican National Convention. I find this interesting for a couple of reasons here. One is that the Republican National Convention, if you remember this is the coming out party for the Lock Her Up movement via Michael Flynn during his speech chanting lock her up, lock her up. And you also had Alex Jones and Roger Stone running around the Republican National Convention, not only wearing Clinton rape t-shirts, but also this is around the time of the launch of the Hillary for Prison t-shirts. And this is right at the time, this is around a lot of the intrigue surrounding WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi and also Ted Malloch, among others, in their possible relation, their possible connections in the leaking of the Democratic DNC emails, which I think was just the day after the Republican National Convention where Trump and Pence were nominated. So that's one interesting aspect of it. And I would like to look back, perhaps if we can just like do a timeline, look back with the benefit of hindsight at just all of the goings on at the RNC and the lock her up chants and the real efforts to really begin, demanding the imprisonment of Hillary Clinton, and somehow Trump's going to be the hammer to make this possible, and all of her associates, and the timing of that and these meetings between Stone and Farage and Alex Jones that is been documented by the maker of this Get Me Roger Stone documentary to this Dial M for Mueller that's been detailed on this Dial M for Mueller podcast. And the other reason why, and then in the relation to the ensuing leaking of the DNC emails, and the other reason I find this really interesting is because one of the things I think has puzzled a lot of people is trying to find a direct relationship between the Trump campaign, right? Is what we're looking at, the Trump campaign, then headed by Paul Manafort, who of course is such a key operative in all of this for numerous reasons, and elements of the Russian government, perhaps Russian intelligence, maybe an outlet such as the GRU. And in this Dial M for Mueller podcast, it's mentioned that it appears in the opinion of the host of this podcast that the real intermediaries between, say, the Trump campaign via Manafort and Stone, and also the elements of Russian government, Russian intelligence, would be one Aaron Banks and another close associate of Nigel Farage's. And the name is escaping me of the other close associate, but Aaron Banks is known as Mr. Brexit, the money bags, the financier of the Brexit movement, the chief financier. And in this case, if that is true, that Aaron Banks and this other individual were the key intermediaries between the Trump campaign under Manafort before it transitioned to Steve Bannon, and elements related to the Russian government and Russian intelligence, I think that would be important, because here at this level, if we're also looking for a smoking gun to link Israel to this, it would be something like Brexit and the operatives behind Brexit, because if you remember, it was Breitbart, made in America, conceived in Israel, that was the primary promoter of the Brexit movement, that was primarily responsible for Brexit getting passed here in the UK. So I find also the extension of this investigation into elements of Brexit and a lot of these machinations that appear to have been going on around the time of the Republican convention, and we're not trying to say definitively who was responsible for this DNC leak, which was at the epicenter of all of this collusion narrative. But I think all of this is very intriguing, and I hope that in the near to distant future, we're going to start to get more and more answers about this. And by the way, I will link to this Dial M for Mueller podcast in the show notes for people who want to listen to this on their own. And I apologize if I butchered names in the process of going over this description here.
Yeah, a lot of elements there. Thank you for bringing that connection to the Brexit. So if you think about it, this idea of Trump operation is 11/9, Brexit in many ways, you can sort of think about this relationship of 9/11 to the anthrax attacks, where they appear to be part and parcel of the same, an extension of the same operation. I think this similar thing can be said about Brexit and then Trump's election. It really does. There's a lot of the key pieces are there, and also these interests are there too, and that it does seem that when you look at there, similarly, that there's a lot of highly legitimate reasons that people would have serious critiques of the NATO alliance or things like international trade agreements such as NAFTA. It's also the case that there are highly legitimate reasons for people, especially in a European context, to be critical of aspects of the European Union and the sacrifices of aspects of economic sovereignty and bottom-up building of economies. That type of thing. It's also the case that there's some key actors that obviously benefit. They're very interested in separate cleaving off the UK from the European Union, and you identified them. It's this Russian-Israeli axis. The Israelis, because of the growing sentiment around things like calling Israel to account for the violations of the rights of Palestinians, and then the Russians, Putin's Russian relationship specifically to the long-term interest of breaking up the European alliance and cleaving off aspects of the European alliance away from what's seen as the Atlanticis. So that's obviously right there on the table in terms of some of these interests. It's also interesting that at the same time as these the investigations, the investigations of Trump and Netanyahu are heating up, that you then also have these stories of, I believe, Deutsche Bank being raided by dozens, if not over 100, police operatives in Germany, I believe, and that Deutsche Bank is center to a lot of this. We've already talked briefly about the aspect of where Deutsche Bank represented one of the few banks that was operating in the United States that would, after his multiple bankruptcies, would work with Trump. And so you see it then also as picking up steam, especially sort of towards 2010, in relationship to Deutsche Bank being a key funnel for billions of dollars of Russian dirty money and laundering it in relationship to the West. So those two things go hand in hand in many ways. And we've also briefly touched on the fact that the former Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's son worked at Deutsche Bank and worked in relationship to Trump at a time when I believe they were beginning to loan Trump $1 billion or something like that. So it does look like there is a global rising of aspects of the investigation into some of these this deep corruption. And the Netanyahu investigation, we've of course seen over well more than a year that it's on the verge. There's enough grounds there to indict Netanyahu for on corruption charges, but it never happens. So we'll see if this time it actually happens. And we should remember that we trace some of these networks that really tie in the relationship between Russia and Israel, but then also into the city of London in the UK in terms of this investigation into Netanyahu. Because you see people like Len Blavatnik, who, along with people like Lev Levayev, who, by the way, another recent story is Lev Levayev, the point I was going to make about Lev Levayev and Blavatnik is they're both some of the biggest. Not only are they both related with Trump and the Trump politics, but they're both some of the biggest donors to the Chabad network worldwide, which of course is part what we see in relationship to this network that ties together Trump and Putin. But this other story that's recently come out in relationship to Lev Levayev is that I believe one of his sons was even maybe arrested for issues of smuggling of diamonds. And now it looks like Levayev is going to be interviewed by Israeli police, but he does not want to go to Israel to be interviewed, and so he was trying to get them to come to Russia, where he is right now, to interview him. So there's
I thought Putin kicked all of them out, Jeremy.
Right, and where's Mogilevich, right? And yeah, exactly. And so it is interesting, this transfer that Putin made he whittled down. He picked a whole nother group of oligarchs to maintain and work with, and they all seem to be sort of Chabadniks of some sort. So that is pretty interesting, and it's Blavatnik is implicated into these Case 1000 in Case 2000 investigations into Netanyahu. And we pointed out last year in our show about Trump and the media, I think, that James Packer, the Australian billionaire who was invested in Dune Rat Pack Entertainment, which is the former company that Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, was involved in, had actually Packer had sold his share, and it does look like that Blavatnik is the one who then sidled in and bought that up, and Packer was a neighbor to Netanyahu, and so this is front and center around here, and it looks like that even someone like Arnon Milchan is central to these investigations also. So that's going on, and then meanwhile, I just want to get a little bit deeper into this question of Firtash and those people that are saying that there's still nothing really there in relationship to the Russia investigation.
Dmitry Firtash, particularly.
Oh yes, what did I say?
You just said his last name. I was okay.
Oh yeah, Dmitry Firtash, and that. People like Aaron Mate, who was formerly of the Real News Network, who's interviewed, some of the authors who have done some of the investigations, people from Luke Harding, who's now being looked at very closely around this story that was published in The Guardian with not very clear sourcing about Manafort allegedly having gone to meet Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy multiple times, starting in somewhere in 2013. And now it's not clear whether that story is going to hold up or whether it was a disinformation of some sort and from some source. But the people like Aaron Mate have interviewed people like Luke Harding. Also, he's interviewed Craig Unger, whose book House of Trump, House of Putin goes really deep into the background of Mogilevich and Trump's deep background with large aspects of the Russian mob and how it all fits into Putin's strategies in many ways. And but Aaron Mate sort of knocked all of these down and not really followed up with a lot of the actual facts. And he's actually recently written an article in the Nation that's titled "Mueller Takes Aim, But Is Trump in Trouble? Why Russiagate's New Bombshells Might Not Be That Explosive," by Aaron Mate, November 30th, 2018. And he, goes over a lot of the history, and then the new sight of Matthew Whitaker as Attorney General, and what does all of this mean? But I do find it interesting, and this is what I keep on trying to propose: is like it's the same as 9/11. Even if you think that that it's not going anywhere, or that it's a cover up at the official level. And I would actually propose that to me, it looks like the Mueller investigation is actually going to much more significant places than what ended up happening with the U.S. government's investigations into 9/11, which not only were the 9/11 Commission, and actually was not an investigation. It was formally called an exposition. And as people who are tuned into that know, the outline of the 9/11 Commission was written beforehand by Philip Zelikow. who was the real director of the commission. But this Mueller investigation into not only Russia, but into what it really is looking at is all aspects of foreign involvement in the 2016 election, and then also how that ties into counterintelligence investigations. And of course, part and parcel of that is things like compromat, which involves not only things like dirty money in someone's background, as it looks like that Trump has millions, if not billions, in his background, especially as it was amped up as he got deeper in bed with the Russian Mafia in the 2000s. But before that too, and he was always mobbed up, not only with the Russian intensely Jewish mob, but also the Italian mob in many ways. But you see that this, we've pointed out for a long time that if you just only talk about in relationship to so-called Russiagate about Facebook posts and the emails, the DNC emails, and all of that, you're missing a key part of the investigation, which is where we took on someone like Jimmy Dore when he interviewed Luke Harding about his book, where Jimmy Dore just sort of dismissed the whole thing out of hand when he was talking about specific.
I think Dore was actually discussing Aaron Mate's interview with Harding. Is that correct?
You're right. That's true because I don't think Dore actually interviewed Harding himself. That's correct. And so what Dore set aside was the actual counterintelligence investigation here, that a lot of it is open source at this point, that shows this is a long-term cultivation operation in relationship to Trump. And I've pointed out, even I think on False Flag Weekly News a couple weeks ago, that this sort of troika, this Bayrock troika that was part of pushing Trump Soho, right? You have Sater, right? You have Tawfiq Arif, and you have Tamir Sapir. That is a very interesting grouping of people, and that I pointed out that Sapir had a deep connection with actually having started, I believe, an electronics shop that sold TVs and all of this back in the 80s with one Sam Kislin, and that it was known that it was the place to go for any sort of Russian or at that point Soviet intelligence operatives or Soviet diplomats, that in the New York area, that was the place to go. And it so happened that this is where Trump buys all of his televisions for some of his hotels. And so to me, that is very, very intriguing when looked at in a counterintelligence way. And there's also these more current stories about things like these gifts of these hundreds of $1 million paintings of some sort, or very expensive paintings that are given by Russians to Trump and or Kushner. And so there's two pieces to those kinds of stories, and that you have it looks like the art world is a very key place, including things like real estate, along with real estate, to wash dirty money. And so you see Trump at the epicenter of washing dirty money, Russian mobbed up money via real estate. But then you also see some of these same kind of characters. For example, Rybolovlev, I think his name is. He's the guy who bought Trump's one of his property down in Florida. And actually, I believe that property is the same one that one Les Wexner had originally built on, and that one Jeffrey Epstein was in a bidding war with Trump to gain that property. But then I believe it was like in the run-up, or in the year before, I can't remember the exact year, but that Trump sold that property at a highly inflated price. I think Trump got it for sort of dozens of millions of dollars, and then sold it to Rybolovlev to for over, I believe, almost $100 million. That this Rybolovlev not only shows up at key nodal points in the campaign, 2016 campaign, where his private plane sort of shows up in these American cities alongside the Trump campaign, but he's also now been, I believe, is questioned in Spain for things involving potential things like laundering, and he's being investigated for the purchase of art. I believe that's part of it, or he's definitely involved in purchasing of art at highly escalated levels. So this interesting scenario of these gifts of these very expensive paintings by these Russian oligarchs to aspects of the Trump family are not only indicative of the whole scene of washing money through expensive art, and people should go look at the background of this Rybolovlev in relationship, I believe, to maybe even MBS or another Saudi prince, or maybe it's the MBZ from UAE. I can't remember, but go look at that. And then, so that's one piece of it. But the other side of it is those are the kind of perfect scenarios where you can have things like surveillance mechanisms inputted into them, and they're hung on the wall and all of that. So that's a long-winded roundabout way to talk about that. I think that the counterintelligence background of Trump as a person of interest who's being cultivated before it was Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, is really, really interesting, including these kind of open-ended questions about why was he purchasing televisions, another perfect place to have surveillance equipment, especially think about how important hotels are, and even in relationship to the allegations against Trump in terms of the dirty dossier and hotels as places of where compromat happens. So that why was it that Trump was getting his hundreds of TVs for his hotels in Manhattan from a KGB go-to electronics shop? So these are interesting questions that people like Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate should be digging into, including this question about Dmitry Firtash and his relationship with Mogilevich and Manafort and this Clinton lawyer Lanny Davis. And these are really important questions. And again, especially for these anti-imperialists, Rybolovlev, this formerly mentioned Russian oligarch, he's a fertilizer king. I think he's like a potash king. Right, Firtash is a natural gas oligarch. So these are all imperialists of some sort. These are resource imperialists, and so the real left here should have a serious investigative critique of these figures. And so I just wanted one last thing before we move on. I wanted to just lay out a little bit more detail that's sort of beyond my immediate grasp in relationship to Manafort and Firtash and what it all means. And this is from the book Trump, Russia, A Definitive History by Seth Hatena. And I got this from the library, but I have seen that there is a PDF portions on the internet of this book that lays out a lot of these details. So on page 152, it talks about right after Manafort's work with Yanukovych, how Manafort actually did some of the sort of stylistic work with Yanukovych to westernize him, things around the outfits and the way he spoke and all of these types of things. It then gets down to the nitty-gritty. So it says, although he was earning millions for his political consulting work in Ukraine, Paul Manafort began using his connections to make even more money. He met Dmitry Firtash, a wealthy Ukrainian businessman involved in the natural gas trade, who had friends in top posts in Yanukovych's administration, and pitched him on his grand vision for Bulgari Tower, a $1.5 billion skyscraper project in Midtown Manhattan on the corner of Park Avenue and 56th Street. It was said to be one of the most valuable development sites in North America. The Ukrainian natural gas tycoon had millions to invest because Gazprom, the natural gas giant controlled by the Kremlin, had given his unpronounceable company, Ros-Ukrenergo, a monopoly on all gas trades between Russia and Ukraine. This incredibly lucrative deal was widely viewed as a partnership with organized crime. Firtash was believed to be a frontman for Semyon Mogilevich. In court papers in Chicago, where Firtash was indicted in a separate international racketeering conspiracy, prosecutors described him as a, quote, upper echelon, unquote, associate of Russian organized crime. In 2008, Firtash agreed to commit $112 million to Manafort's Bulgari Tower project and wired in a $25 million deposit. The deposit came from Raiffeisen Zentralbank, the Austrian bank that U.S. officials believe served as a Mogilevich front. The tower deal later collapsed. While he was lining up investments from Firtash, Manafort proposed to Oleg Deripaska that they go into business together. The resulting company was Pericles Emerging Market Partners LP, a private equity fund in the Cayman Islands. Manafort described it to Deripaska as a vehicle to pursue investments that, quote, leverage our business and political relationships, unquote, in Ukraine. Pericles sought to achieve an impressive compound annual return rate of 30% by investing in Ukraine as well as other areas of interest to Deripaska: Russia, the former Soviet republics, Montenegro, and Eastern and Southern Europe. The offering memorandum touted Davis and Manafort's experience with political campaigns at, quote, the highest level, unquote. The Russian oligarch gave Manafort a tentative commitment to invest $200 million in the fund. Then it talks about how they screwed with Deripaska around some purchase of a communications company. It talks about the Cyprus Bank, where Gates and Manafort were pocketing all the money from Deripaska, and then it talks. Then it brings in Putin, and I just wanted. There's a lot more here, and the details are very convincing. That this idea that Manafort was only trying to serve the U.S. interests and only bring Ukraine into back into the European fold is not line up with the facts. Sure, that was some of the talking points that they were pitching to Europe, which is exactly what Manafort's agreement with people like Deripaska was that he was going to advocate for Putin Kremlin interests into the West and try to westernize those interests and pitch them. And one last thing I remember is that it was said that Manafort it looked like he had his own shadow government in relationship to Yanukovych's Ukraine, and that he had someone in every single cabinet to be able to go after his own interests. So there's a lot of bodies buried behind the Manafort and the Cohen investigations into their criminality, and it very much ties directly into Trump and his long-term apparent criminality in relationship to the Russian mob.
Yeah, thanks for the breakdown there. That was very. I think what you're noticing in the process is a couple of things, and this is where obviously I think the Aaron Mates and the Jimmy Dores, and then you can throw in other people, obviously your Max Blumenthal's, your Abby Martins, many others on the anti-imperialist left, so to speak, is how they would describe this as kind of the anti-establishment left, and then also to an extent more of these alt-right anti-Zionist types, although I think their talking points, while being very similar, are also very different in some regards to this whole so-called Russiagate, which we call more or less Mobgate investigation. You'll see that there is a confluence of where their views do line up and are actually very similar when it comes to these key issues related to the whole topic of Russia and of Trump and of U.S. foreign policy, and also the elements of domestic aspects of this. But what is clear with this is that this is an investigation. I think that this is where one of the problems is with this narrative, and I think this feeds into a lot of the skepticism and just the outright dismissal of this by a lot of what I would call well-meaning people on the left and probably on the right as well, quote unquote, is this whole perception this is all just Russia. This is just Vladimir Putin and the Russians trying to subvert our democracy. This is a harken back to the Cold War. We're in the days when we're in another Cold War with the Russians who are just trying to destroy us and all this. And that is just so far off the mark because all of this goes so far beyond Vladimir Putin. It goes so far beyond the fall of the Soviet Union, even goes way before that, as we're seeing here, back to the 1980s, and these key transactions of this television equipment, of these televisions from this known KGB front operation here in the U.S. and the implications of that, and just going back everything. And this is one of the areas where I think Craig Unger is so strong at, is it's just so far beyond just Vladimir Putin and Russia and generic Cold War narrative. I mean, this is so much deeper than that. It has much more consequential, much bigger consequences than just that, although we obviously don't want any type of war with Russia. Obviously, it goes so far beyond that in American democracy and all this nonsense. So I'd advise people to really, really take a more serious look at this.
And Unger, I think, would also point out that one of the main points he says that he tries to make when he goes on people's show is that yes, goes beyond Putin and Russia, but it goes right through Putin and Russia. And his main point is that if you don't understand the global Russian mafia as an extension or as an extension of aspects of Putin's national security apparatus, then you're really missing a key piece of this. And so I do think that does need to be dealt with in the questions about the actual potential cyber involvement of things like the GRU in cyber hacking and all of that, some of which has been put on this legal record in allegations by Mueller and his investigation, do really need to be dealt with. And you can do that without, in a similar way that we've talked about how the McCarthyite aspect, and no one wants that. Well, very few people want this idea of sort of looking for a communist or a Ruski now under every rock. And but the thing was that there was really something to that investigation that then became hijacked or completely missed the point, maybe on purpose, and took it into sort of cultural areas, similarly to what we see now, I think, in many ways. It took it into cultural areas like screenwriters in Hollywood, rather than things like high-level spy rings that run through things like the Rand Corporation or the Defense Policy Board or the State Department, things like that are laid out a lot if you want to go look at it, things like that Brendan O'Connell and Joseph Davis has put up at Securing Our Interests, things like the Silver Master spy ring, early on the Venona documents. That even it was like in Truman's day, there was a strong hint, backed by intelligence evidence, that there was a significant penetration by Soviet aspects. And so in a similar way, we want to have an actual investigation that doesn't sort of smear all kinds of cultural figures in terms of who they voted for. Then you become a Russian agent if you vote for the Green Party or Bernie Sanders or Trump even, but that we actually are looking into the highest levels of this ongoing operation.
That is a fantastic point. I thank you for chiming in there. And I think you finished my point much more eloquently than I was getting at. So I thank you. So I thank you for that. And it is ironic that the term that's used to dismiss critics of this Mobgate narrative here by the McCarthyite narrative. It's McCarthyite label. It's kind of funny that ironically it's associated to Donald Trump's mentor, who's pretty much the brainchild behind a lot of the McCarthyite talking points. That's kind of a funny irony. But real quick before we switch topics here, I wanted to bring up this what I thought was a very instructive. You brought this to my attention. A debate that took place on Press TV, Iranian Press TV, this past week between Craig Unger and the aforementioned Craig Unger and Mike Harris of Veterans Today. And I thought that this debate was very instructive of a lot of what is wrong with, I think, the but with both, I think it was a lot of elements of all of different sides of this Russia Gate, Mob Gate, whatever you want to call it, narrative, and also the critics of Trump as well as supporters of Trump's, and just in the way the narratives are laid out, the way talking points are used, and just you see various blind spots come out, I think, in both sides of this debate. And there was a very instructive moment where I thought very, very foolishly and very Mike Harris dismisses that this is who, by the way, seems to be very pro-Trump, very pro-Putin, dismisses the idea of any type of Trump collusion with quote-unquote Russia as being, no, you see, it's not the Russian mafia, it's the Khazar mafia, bringing in the old idea of the age-old Khazarian Jewish conspiracy. And I thought that right away was I thought it was very ignorant in that, quite honestly, to bring that up. And then Craig Unger gets very defensive and calls it anti-Semitic. And so you have, on one hand, you have where this Mike Harris is just completely trying to downplay any type of anything going beyond his idea that it's just simply the age-old Jewish conspiracy to subvert us, and that good non-Jews like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin couldn't have anything to do with it. And then also you've got Craig Unger, who clearly seems to have a blind spot towards what he perceives as being anti-Semitism, although I can't quite blame the reaction the way that Mike Harris brought up the Khazarian thing just out of the blue in the middle of a debate about the Russian mafia and Donald Trump. He just brings in the Khazarian question. So you see the limits from a lot of different people when these complicated topics come up, such as the Russian mafia, and I would say is being disproportionately very Jewish aspect of it. Clearly is playing a very key role in this whole operation. And we might even say the key role in this whole operation in so many areas. But ultimately, I think that even though Craig Unger does kind of downplay the anti-Semitic or the Jewish element of it, in some ways he's talked about it in interviews with the Times of Israel, for example. He did discuss it in all of the Jewish names that pop up in his 59 people that he has tied from directly relating Trump and Putin together. There are a lot of Jewish names that pop up in there, but I'd still say he was a little more on the ball than this generic, just kind of right wing nationalistic defense of Trump and Putin is just automatically poo-pooing anything that comes up in relation to this investigation as having their involvement in this. So I thought that was an instructive debate for a couple of reasons, and that being one of them right there. I just thought that displayed a lot of the shortcomings of, in our opinion, of various people that are analyzing this whole narrative, all of this from very different perspectives. So I wanted to bring that up.
Very instructive. I agree, and maybe we'll further dissect it in the future. And I do think, in being fair to both of them, that it is the case. It looked like Mike Harris was willing to accept that if the facts led towards this kind of mobbed up scenario around Trump, then we definitely should go there. And like you pointed out, that people like Unger have dealt with the actual facts, maybe not the full implications, but definitely some of the facts around some of the highly Jewish aspect of this connection between Russia and Israel. And then he's definitely laid out the Chabad connection. And we will link to both that debate and also this Times of Israel article that you mentioned, where Unger is interviewed about this specific issue and more, that really allows him to sort of put forth his questions and his concerns about these kind of areas. But thank you for bringing that up, Greg.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll also link Jonas Alexis, another person affiliated with Veterans Day, and his response to the Unger-Harris debate, which was just pretty much just a full-bore Putin apologia, by the way. And we'll link to that as well. But, man, we've got about 9 minutes left. I tell you what, time flies. Do you want to get real quick for a little bit, since it is timely with relation to this very, very big article that came out, very, very extensive Miami Herald series of articles exposing so many aspects of of Jeffrey Epstein's operations, particularly focusing on on how a lot of the methods that were utilized in terms of underage women and their involvement in this whole very extensive operations relates to one Alexander Acosta being considered for Attorney General, the current Labor Secretary, who basically hashed out this sweetheart deal for Jeffrey Epstein when he was facing the possibility of facing some serious prison time back in 2007. You stumbled upon an article from February of this past year, which is just so flown completely under the radar, and it shocks me just how under the radar it is. It has flown by Wayne Madsen, where it not only discusses Katie Johnson, the then 13-year-old who accused Donald Trump of and Jeffrey Epstein of rape. This came up a little bit during the run-up to the election, but very, very little. I mean, all the usual suspects that you would think just hate Trump so much and just want to stop him and just want to destroy him at all costs. None of them mentioned this story at all. And I would think even if it was completely entirely fake news, that they would still use it against him because, that's something very powerful, obviously, rape of an underage female, yet nobody brought this up. But anyway, in the process of this article, a second person was named, a young girl named Maria. And Jeremy, do you want to get into this a little bit?
Yes. And before I forget, I just want to one last thing that I wanted to mention about Dmitry Firtash is this Tablet magazine article titled, "Will Donald Trump's Data Analytics Company Allow Russia to Access Research on U.S. Citizens?" by Anne Marlowe. And this is back August 22nd, 2016, that goes to some of the background of the SEL and Cambridge Analytica and points out that it's tied also in not only to Vincent Cenguis, who we've spoken about before, but also to Dmitry Firtash, it looks like. So yes, now this article, I couldn't believe also that we hadn't heard of this yet. I had heard this question about Maria as related to these allegations against Trump in the run-up to the 2016 election about an alleged assault and rape that involved both him and Jeffrey Epstein in relationship to what was then a teenage girl. I believe she was 13 at the time. She had since been identified as Katie Johnson in lawsuits, and I'm hoping that's not her real name because she then supposedly got tons of threats, phone calls, and then ultimately in the days leading up to the election, she'd refiled. And it looks like it was moving forward where the judge was actually going to demand that both Epstein and Trump appear, which was very, in the early days of this lawsuit. And then there was going to be an announcement about it, and then it got pulled too. And of course, all of the Trump supporters say this is just the Gloria Steinem's network, and there's nothing to this. This is George Soros. And but meanwhile, I think
Gloria Allred, I believe.
Gloria Allred, that's right. The Gloria Allred, thank you.
Well, they're all Jewish. You don't have to distinguish between them. They're all Jewish.
Jewish feminists. They're all working for George Soros. And so this case, and I'll link also to it's at the memoryhole2.org. It's titled "All Documents in the Doe v. Trump Lawsuits" from October 12th, 2016. But this article you mentioned, it's called "New Information Emerges in, quote, Maria, unquote, Trump Story" by Wayne Madsen and Andrew Craig at the justiceintegrity.org. And I will just read a few paragraphs here to give people a sense of what this is all about, because the Epstein story is reemerging in a serious way. There is some serious journalism going on down there at Miami Herald, and pointing about how Epstein really sort of got away with this in the wake of these crimes being found out, and of course he's surrounded by these networks such as people like Dershowitz, as you pointed out, but also people like Ken Starr, and even in the book Fire and Fury, remember that, by Michael Wolff, on page 28, it talks about how Tom Barak, the grandson of Lebanese immigrants, is a starstruck real estate investor of legendary acumen who owns Michael Jackson's former oddball Paradise Neverland Ranch. with Jeffrey Epstein, the New York financier, who would become a tabloid regular after accusations of sex with underage girls and a guilty plea to one count of soliciting prostitution that sent him to jail in 2008 in Palm Beach for 13 months, Trump and Barack were a 1980s and 90s set of nightlife musketeers. So besides the lukewarm denials of people like Roger Stone right in the middle of the 26 campaign when questions of Epstein came up, basically say, well, just like Trump is the whole series of these indictments from people like all the way from Papadopoulos to even Cohen, really. It's always like, well, I didn't even know him. Trump's always, I didn't even know him. And so the same thing was said by Roger Stone in relationship to Epstein. Trump, he didn't barely even knew him, and he, rejected him after it became clear that he was a pedophile. But meanwhile, this even reporting like this by Michael Wolff shows that they were very close for a long time. And so now I'm going to read from this story by Wayne Madsen and Andrew Craig.
I'm glad you found that. And real quick, I know we only got a couple minutes. I was going to say real quick that remember Roger Stone talks about how Trump never flew on the Lolita Express, right? Well, if you're thinking about this, if this story is true, and I really hope it's not true, but I mean, if this story is true and you start to see this circumstantial evidence just based, I think one of the big smoking guns is just how much it's been ignored. For example, I think that's huge in implications of all of this. The possibility of the story indeed being a true story of this events with Trump and Maria Johnson, and now Katie Johnson. Now Maria as well. Also, said to happen in a townhouse owned by Leslie Wexner. You go right back to the mega group once again. Is that even if this is, Trump didn't have to fly on the Lolita Express to be compromised if this is the case. I just wanted to point that out. I think that's important.
Yes, and remember who also is involved, been implicated in the Epstein rings is one Ehud Barak, right? The commander of Sayeret Matkal, the prime minister, the former head of Israeli military intelligence, and also the guy who said that he was the one who put Harvey Weinstein in connection with Black Cube, the corporatized, privatized Israeli intelligence firm that was used to attack his accusers. Okay, so in the last minute here, just to give people an idea of what the allegations here, and then we'll link to the story. It says, quote, new information has emerged in the joint Wayne Madsen report Justice Integrity Project investigation of the, quote, Maria, unquote, case. Maria was temporarily held for ransom in 1993, according to witnesses speaking to police. As we previously reported, Katie Johnson alleged in federal lawsuits that Donald Trump and his friend, billionaire Jeffrey Epstein, raped her when she was 13 in New York City in 1994. Johnson's alleged allegations alleged also that the two men raped a 12-year-old, only identified as quote-unquote Maria. Our investigation discovered that Maria had been abducted from Waterbury, Connecticut in March 1993 when she was 11. Eventually, Maria ended up at quote-unquote parties at a Midtown Manhattan townhouse owned by Epstein's billionaire friend Les Wexner, where underage girls were allegedly sexually assaulted by Trump and Epstein. We previously reported, including via the graphic at right showing the mansion and file photos of Trump and Epstein, that Maria's kidnappers were involved in a child trafficking ring that provided abductees to wealthy individuals like Trump and Epstein. Lawyers for Trump and Epstein have sought to deny or otherwise downplay the claims. And then it goes into all of the detail here. And we should also remind people in our last 10 seconds here that who's also involved with Epstein is Ghislaine Maxwell. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was not only a known Mossad asset, Mossad agent, but also potentially a KGB agent, and, by the way, a business partner of one Semyon Mogilevich. So where is the money that Epstein actually in so-called invests coming from? These are questions that need to be asked. And the other question here, of course, is what is the nature of the human trafficking operations that surround these networks, and how can we shut them down? So until next week, Antidote, we out.
All right, goodbye.